Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week is going to be the turn of the author journalist. It is going to be the one and only Pat Thomas, who I spoke to very recently to find out about Jerry Rubin, who a few years ago he brought a book out titled Did It, and that's subtitled From Yippie to Yuppie, Jerry Rubin, an American revolutionary, available from all good bookshops and also online. So anyway, this is the interview, and after several minutes of casual chat, we got down to that very exciting subject that was, yes, a background to the world that is Jerry Rubin. Anyway, Pat, take it away.
In a way, we'll get to that. So basically, I have a brother who's 10 years older than me. And in 1973 or 4, when I was about 10, my brother was about 18, he brought a book into the house called Steal This Book by Abbie Hoffman.
Oh, right.
Who was Jerry Rubin's partner. You know, it's I often compare them to like Lennon and McCartney or Jagger and Richards or something. And so Steal This Book, I was a little too young to understand the political ramifications, but it had a lot of humor. It was very anti-authoritarian. It was also like how to, make phone calls for free, from pay boxes, how to steal albums by putting them in a pizza box, how to blow things up. Anyway, thought it was quite funny. And really kind of my first obsession was really with Abbie Hoffman. And Abbie Hoffman at that point was in hiding. He spent a good chunk of the 70s kind of running away from the FBI and all that stuff. So when he reemerged around 1980, I went to a couple college campuses to hear him speak. By this time, Jerry Rubin had made some changes. Jerry had decided to shave off his beard and to stop trying to, mess with the government and kind of became a little more mainstream. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is Jerry he never became a right-winger. He never became a Republican. He never became a Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher supporter. Unfortunately, the internet is filled with these misinformation and lies. Jerry wanted to make money because he had been orphaned and his parents were working class. He also believed in solar energy and green energy. He was trying to get people to invest in that. He was trying to get companies to take seriously the idea that they should have people of color. So he just, he was no longer a hippie and he was no longer a militant, but that didn't mean he wasn't progressive. Anyway, long story short, I realized about 10 plus years ago that there was no books at all about Jerry Rubin. Abbie Hoffman has several different biographies. And so I approached Jerry Rubin's family and they let me go through thousands of items, many of which is in my book, Did It. There's personal letters and his phone book and journals and photographs and things. And then I wound up interviewing almost 100 people who were friends with Jerry and Abbie and the Yippies. Many, of course, were Yippies themselves. And anyway, that's the long, short version of
how it came across, because it is quite an extraordinary story. And like you, I don't know, I was born in 64, so I kind of missed very much the 60s.
We're the same age. Okay.
Okay. We're the same age. So it was very much later that Abbie Hoffman came onto my radar. And I was, for some reason, obsessed with the 60s and the counterculture and became sort of much more interested and dug down. And you started, with the basic things of watching Woodstock or Monterey Pop Festival and listen to the albums. And then you start digging a bit further. And then there's little stories like, Pete Townsend, hitting, Hoffman with his guitar at Woodstock. And, these kind of things start to come up. And then this other character appears, Jerry Rubin, as well as all these other bits and pieces and these kind of, and obviously in the UK, Vietnam wasn't such a big gig as it was in America, and then you had Nixon. So Rubin was this kind of interesting character. And it's interesting because I was in the late 80s that I kind of got this book, which does feature all those little bits, which I was quite excited by because
Sure.
it had all those things about how you know, could just pretend to get, you know, make out that you're, you know, you're a promoter, or, you know, how to get free records via sort of starting a publication, and all these kind of little scams, I suppose. He was a real scam merchant. But Rubin was the kind of the character who started so radically and then had this incredible shift. But then at the same time, you know, had people like, you know, John Lennon and Yoko Ono sort of being very kind of sort of fatuated by him as well.
Yeah, well, one of the PDFs I sent you was very UK centric, which is that Rubin came to the UK, I think in 70, and was on the David Frost show and sort of took it over. There was a little bit of a British Yippie contingent. There was his name is right on the tip of my tongue, Mick Farron, who was in the dance, right? And so they, you know, they took over the Frost show. They started smoking. They started smoking pot on the Frost show. Then Jerry went over to Northern Ireland, where I think he hung out a little bit with the IRA, and then he got deported. I don't know if you had a chance to pour over all that, but so, you know, so Rubin, you know, had this whole little, you know, in fact, one of the pages in my book, and again, I think it's in the PDF I sent you, is all these front page news of all the major UK newspapers saying, you know, get this scumbag out of the UK. He has to be deported. Call the Home Office. Let's get rid of him. So, you know, Jerry is far from a household name in the UK, but he did have this sort of 15 minutes worth of fame over there.
Yes.
Now, John and Yoko saw this David Frost event and thought it was amazing. So when John and Yoko, by this point, they were politicized, right? They had done Power to the People and, you know, these types of songs. So when John and Yoko, and again, this was another chapter I sent you, when John and Yoko moved to New York in late 71, the first person they meet is Jerry Rubin, and they start talking about, let's get Nixon out of office, right? Let's do a big concert tour with John and Yoko and maybe Dylan. You know, so Lennon, Rubin is very responsible in many ways for the album Sometime in New York City. And he's even mentioned a few times by name. There's, you know, Standing on the Corner waiting for Jerry to show up. That's Lennon's song. And then there's a Yoko Ono song about something about, you know, Eldridge Cleaver and Jerry Rubin. So Jerry was very integral to John and Yoko during their political years. I personally love Lennon's political songs. I know a lot of people, you know, think they're shit, but anyway, I'm a fan.
Well, I was always quite struck because I was quite young. My brother had a couple of albums in the early 70s, and one of them was a John Lennon one, and it had that woman, you know, the song, you know, "Woman is of the world," and that was like, wow, that's kind of quite different to anything. And you know, bizarrely, I kind of got it. You know, I wouldn't, you know, I'm not boasting, but I kind of understood what he was kind of coming up about. And you know, another one on the album about Everybody Loves You When You're 6 Foot Under, and you know, it was a very dark album. You know, and it was, you know, and before then I'd been, you know, that age where I just watched the Beatles films, and they were all fun and having a gay time, weren't they? So suddenly you got this one character who was just so sort of had so much energy and sort of edge to him as well. Are you able just to explain a little bit about the whole idea of the Chicago 8, you know, just to give an idea of what this is? Because it's
well, basically, you know, the Vietnam War was very important, or, you know, very, yes, I guess that's you know, it was a topic of conversation for young people in America because we had a draft. In other words, I guess you'd also call it conscription, maybe? Conscription.
Yes.
So in other words, if you were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old, you could easily be told, hey, you're going to Vietnam whether you like it or not. So obviously, young adult men got very politicized, and young adult women, you know, didn't want to have their boyfriends get their heads blown off. So that became such a thing. And that's really what Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman's legacy is all about, which is they wanted to stop the Vietnam War. They wanted as many young people to protest. And they did that by incorporating sort of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Because, you know, a lot of the anti-Vietnam War activists were very, you know, it was very academic. Like, Well, we want to let you know that we've been in Vietnam since 1954 because the French got there first, right? And, if you're 18 years old, you don't want a friggin' history lesson. You want someone to hand you a joint, you get high, someone tells you the Vietnam War is effed up, and you're like, yeah, I'm not going, right? And so Jerry and Abbie, that was their thing. And then they aligned with some of the more academics. They aligned with Tom Hayden and Rennie Davis. They aligned with the Black Panthers. A lot of young black men were getting sent to Vietnam. And as Muhammad Ali famously said, no Vietnamese ever called me the
Yes.
N-word.
Yeah.
Right. So the Chicago Eight were a group of guys, along with hundreds, if not thousands of other young people, that descended on Chicago in August of 1968. In America, when we're going to pick a president, there is a convention where all the politicians get together and they go, do we want Hubert Humphrey? Do we want Bobby Kennedy? Do we want, unfortunately, Bobby Kennedy, who ideally would have become the next president, he was assassinated, right, in June of 68. And I see that very much as a political assassination because he wanted to end the Vietnam War. Without getting into this whole big thing, I think Kennedy was assassinated by the U.S. government. That's a whole nother topic. But anyway, Hubert Humphrey, who was now the then vice president, he became who was going to be the next Democratic president. And so thousands of these hippies are in the streets of Chicago protesting, but they're not rioting. They're not breaking things. They're not throwing Molotov cocktails. They're not busting windows. That happened when the Chicago police came in and started beating the shit out of these guys, right? In fact, if you look at the films, it's the cops that are rioting. They're busting open heads with clubs, right? This type of thing. And so Nixon got elected, and Nixon probably should have thanked these guys because what happened is the average American looked at these riots and said, well, obviously the Democratic Party is unwieldy. They can't even handle, their own protesters. But Nixon hated hippies so much. He hated anti-Vietnam War people so much that he decided to prosecute these 8 guys, and they were known as the Chicago Eight. And it was a little bit of everything. There were a couple of academics. There were a couple of hippies. There was a Black Panther. There was a pacifist. And that was a political trial. It's kind of funny when you think of America as being so democratic. This is something that could have happened in Germany in the 30s or
Yes.
somewhere else, right? Well, what happened is the trial made Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman more popular with young people. So all of a sudden, if you were a young person, you went off to college, you'd hang up a picture of Mick Jagger on one wall, and you'd hang a picture of Jerry Rubin on the other wall. They used to make giant Jerry Rubin posters for college kids. I have one.
Yeah.
They're huge. They're like 3 feet by 4 feet. So Rubin and Hoffman became almost like rock stars. And this is not long after that, they met, John and Yoko. So.
Yes, and then because it's interesting, I was listening to one of his interviews or when he's being interviewed, and he sort of gets quite not a huge jail sentence, but compared to Abbie Hoffman, he gets Abbie Hoffman, does he have 6 days and Rubin has 6 months or 9 months, doesn't he?
So, something like that. I mean, luckily these guys were all acquitted, and each of them served a few weeks or months in jail, but nobody thankfully did any years and years in jail.
Yes, which is quite lucky because I think in the 60s there was a guy called Hoppy Hopkins who sort of got busted with a joint, and I think from talking to various people, he never quite got over it, but he was part of that London scene where I think Paul McCartney used to sort of hang out at some bookshop with people like Barry Miles and such folk. So as the 70s progress then, what happens to dear old Jerry? Because he does, things obviously are beginning to change, aren't they?
Well, this is the problem with trying to be philosophical. This is the problem with people who are not in the middle of it. So in other words, when I interviewed Jerry's friends, they said, look, we were yippie protesters, but we weren't famous. So if we were walking down the streets of Manhattan and New York City, people generally left us alone. But in 1970 or 71, if Jerry Rubin was walking down the street in Greenwich Village, New York, some Republican would go up to him and say, "You're Jerry Rubin," and then just punch him right in the face, right? Or he would get arrested and beat up by the police just for being Jerry Rubin. So there was this one last ditch attempt in the 1972 election. Like I said, John and Yoko, Jerry Rubin, a bunch of others wanted to try to force Nixon out of office. They wanted to, the voting age in America used to be 21 years old. Nixon amazingly agreed to drop it down to 18. So all of a sudden there was another, 1.5 million people who were now old enough to vote Nixon out. So they really thought that Nixon would get voted out and we would have George McGovern, Democratic senator, in. And when Nixon won a second time, well, first of all, long story short, it's in my book, Lennon basically had a nervous breakdown. Because he was so convinced that, the good guys were going to win. And Rubin had a little bit of a nervous breakdown where he just said, you know what, when it comes to radical politics, I'm done. And so he leaves New York City right after the election. He drives to San Francisco. He shaves off his beard and he starts getting into a lot of things that were popular in the 70s. Health food, yoga. There was a thing called EST that was kind of like group therapy. Right, so he basically is cleansing himself, detoxing from all the years of the 60s of being beat up, pissed on, pooped on, you name it. And also a little bit about, his parents had died when he was like 18, so he's kind of, he kind of just rebirths. And so for many years, he's really spearheading part of what we call the New Age movement.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, again, health food, yoga, meditation. This was very, very popular in the United States. And I have a feeling probably, popular with in England to some degree as well, as the 60s turned into the 70s. And then by the end of the 70s, he decides to move back to New York City. And he kind of invents the phrase social networking. We take this phrase for granted. We hear it all the time. I'm a social networker. I'm on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter. Long before there was computers, Jerry, this was a way for him to kind of make money, because also keep in mind, nobody would hire this guy. Even though he now had a suit and a tie on, people thought that was a con. They thought, well, what if I give Jerry Rubin the keys to my office and he blows it up on Saturday night, right? So the only way Jerry could eat, pay the rent and eat, was to be self-employed. So he started these things called networking parties, where he would hang posters up around New York City and he'd say, if you're a recent Harvard or Yale college graduate, come to this party on Saturday night and network with your alumni. Or if you're a electrical engineer, come to this party. Because, again, pre-internet, like-minded people couldn't find each other. Right? And so this became a thing. These parties would bring in 500 or 600 people, $5 a piece. There'd be cocktails and drinks. He did that for several years, and that became a thing. He was briefly on Wall Street. If you Google him, say, he was on Wall Street, he sold out, he was a stockbroker. No, he was on Wall Street trying to get people to invest in solar panels and green energy like 10 or 15 years before anybody knew about this stuff. And again, just because he had a suit and a tie on, he did not vote for Ronald Reagan. He did not support people like Maggie Thatcher. He was basically like his fellow Chicago 8 guy, Tom Hayden. He was a liberal Democrat with a tie, wearing a tie.
Which is quite interesting because having I was watching some interviews earlier, and it's interesting his kind of view on the 60s and the drug culture that happened during that period as well. So he'd obviously done a lot of reflecting and realized, and he's quite honest about the fact that, they got it or he got it as wrong as anybody else. He takes that ownership, doesn't
he? He doesn't. And here's the problem. If he had stayed the same, let's just pretend that he stayed with a beard and long hair and smoking pot, you'd be like, hey man, I saw Jerry Rubin in 1985. He was pathetic. He looked like an old stupid hippie, right? Or you yell and go, I saw Jerry Rubin in 1985. He had a suit. Like, in other words, he is going to be scolded no matter what he does. If he stays the same, people go, he's pathetic. If he cleaned up like he did, people say, oh, he sold out. You know what I mean? The problem with being a famous activist is at some point you're screwed because you're neither left wing or right wing enough.
Yes. Well, I think in the UK, what we
Yeah.
definitely used to like is building someone up and then hoping it all goes terribly wrong and they end up penniless, homeless, and hopefully a bit dead. So I mean, we didn't, we struggle a lot with people who don't fit that little mold. It's a bit like, oh my God, that person's done really well.
Yeah.
Pardon?
The UK even does it to musicians.
Oh yeah, we're very good on
Sometimes
musicians.
They'll go, I don't know, the band Pulp is the greatest friggin' band there ever was. And then after, the band Pulp, they suck, right? Like, I see this, I'm just using them as an example. I'm not even a fan. But my point is I've seen the melody maker declare some band God, and 6 months later say they should be taken out to the courtyard and shot, right? It's such a UK thing. Total rubbish.
So it is quite interesting. But I've having sort of gone through a bit of a hippie period and a bit of a sort of anarchist period, and then you get more annoyed with the people that you're part of that community than the people outside that community who are attacking you, and it's often that which gives people a bit of a change, and that's what often becomes quite tiring. It's not the so-called police or the establishment. It's actually the people within those kind of groups that can sort of wear you down. And I would imagine he must have had that in buckets, really.
He did, because the thing is his closest friends, many of them stayed Yippies or hippies, but they still respected Jerry, and Jerry respected him, right? So when I interviewed these people, they still liked Jerry, they still believed in Jerry. The people that seem to be taking pot shots at Jerry are people that never really knew him, but were somehow part of the bigger community. In other words, there were thousands of hippies and yippies and that kind of thing. So you're right. It's sort of the your fellow punters who really can come out.
And how did his relationship with Abbie Hoffman develop over those years? Because Abbie disappears for a long period of time.
One of the things that's explored in my book in a chapter I didn't send you, all the years that Abbie was underground, Jerry would go visit him. He might visit him in Mexico, or he might visit him in some small town in Texas, or, and so Abbie, on one hand, he would publicly say, oh, Jerry sold out, he put on a suit and a tie. But privately, Abbie was like, hey, this guy's still my brother, and he supported me, and I trust him. So there was a bond. Again, I used a little bit of that John Lennon, Paul McCartney thing, where they would occasionally, Lennon loved to diss McCartney or put him down after the Beatles broke up. But, at the end of the day, these guys had some, they still had a bond, they really did.
Yes. And so going, because he survives the 80s, which is fantastic. He's halfway through the 90s. Then how's his life at that stage? Because obviously he dies in the most tragic, well, there's a lot of tragic ways of dying, but this is a particularly weird one, isn't it?
Well, Jerry by the late 80s, he also, because his parents had both died young, in other words, his parents are roughly in their 40s. I think one gets cancer, another one has heart attack. So Jerry became obsessed with it. Hey, I'm getting closer to 40 and 50. I don't want to die. So he became Mr. Health Food. And so he started selling like vitamin drinks and all this stuff, right? So that was now Jerry's new way of making money was, I think he had a health drink called like Wow or Yow or something. But anyway, he wasn't being fulfilled politically or spiritually. And by spiritually, I don't necessarily mean religious. I mean more, your spirit, like what gets you out of bed in the morning, right?
Yeah.
So Jerry was starting to look at new possible political adventures. One thing is he lived here in Los Angeles that had a lot of disenfranchised Black youth. So he was starting to look at, what kind of programs could he put together to help Black youth. He also started to think about his legacy. He wanted to get a documentary made about himself, or maybe get an established author to do biography. So those final years are Jerry kind of trying to figure this out. And actually, on the last, I won't say the last day of his life because he's actually in a coma for a few weeks after that, but we'll say the last day that he was walking and talking as a normal person, he spent the afternoon with another old activist, not a famous one, talking about the types of things that they might do together. And Jerry was a lifelong pot smoker. So he was still getting high. And it was the end of the day. It was like 5 p.m. And now he had what they call the munchies. Like if you smoke a lot of pot,
Yes.
you get hungry. So Jerry, unfortunately, ran across 4 lanes of traffic trying to get to a restaurant, and he did not make it. So he was run over by a car. He was then in a coma for about 2 weeks, and then finally he died.
Yes. Oh, because in the interview that I was watching, where it's kind of edited, so it's just him, he seems to have sort of completely distanced himself from pot smoking and sort of that world. So he obviously doesn't completely do it himself.
No, I'm not sure. I would have to say, I mean, the only thing I can think of is he didn't want to encourage, like he didn't want to be responsible for encouraging other people to smoke, because in the 60s he did. I can't answer why that would be.
Yes. And going
yeah.
back to the book, which is quite fantastically comprehensive from what I've seen so far. I mean, did it take very long to put it together? And did you have a sense of responsibility? Because like you said, there's a few books that he's done, but nothing done by another person who's kind of sort of documented, archived, and celebrated his life.
I initially thought that I would write a very simple little paperback bio. So like if somebody like you said, tell me about Jerry Rubin, I go, hey, here's this £9 paperback.
Yes.
Read this in an afternoon, it'll tell you everything you need to know. But my publisher said, I don't want a little paperback, I want the big book. So his family, his wife, or ex-wife Mimi, welcomed me into her home. I actually moved in with her for 2 months. And I went through thousands of items, like I said, all these papers and things. And then she started calling people. She called, Paul Krasner, who was a famous radical journalist in his own right, good friend of Jerry's. The next thing I know, I thought I might interview 5 or 10 people. I wound up interviewing, like I said, nearly 100. And then it took me 3 or 4 years to figure out what to do with this stuff. So a friend of mine, Kathy Wolf, listened to all the interviews, right? Because all of a sudden I had 50 hours worth of interviews. Oh my God, now what do I do? So she listened to them and took notes, and she said, hey, here's a really good, she started dividing the quotes into topics, right? So you go, well, here's some great quotes about the Chicago 8, and here's some great quotes about Woodstock or whatever. So the book, after that, I now had a framework to work from. And I also read at least 200 or 300 other books. Jerry might only be in a book for 1 paragraph, or he might be in the book for 3 paragraphs, but I gathered all this other information. And long story short, the book is available, by the way, in the UK. It's distributed by a company called Turnaround.
Oh, yes.
Turnaround Book Distribution. So people can find it in the UK. It can be ordered at a local bookstore from Turnaround or directly from Turnaround, their own website. So it's not impossible to get in the UK.
And I've seen it obviously on Amazon. So was it the case? Because obviously it's quite an extraordinary book to do. And from, the PDFs you showed me, did you have quite a lot of help with editors and designers to sort of bring it together?
Yeah, there's a guy named Jacob Covey who works. The book was published by a company in Seattle called Fantagraphics Books that does a lot of what we call graphic novels and cartoon, sort of cartoons for adults, for lack of a better word.
Yes.
And so he has a really good eye. And if you flip through the book, you see like little drawings or little cool, there's a lot going on in the book. It's very artistically done, and that's really Jacob's magic, if you will.
Yeah, because I don't know if you.
I wouldn't quite call the book like vibrant.
Pardon?
Go ahead, sorry.
I was going to say, a few years ago at the dear old V&A Museum in London, there was an exhibition called So You Want a Revolution. So it was all sort of talking about the social, political, and cultural times. And so I went and interviewed quite a few people, including Joe Boyd, who was part of that scene, who produced people like the early Pink Floyd, and then went on to do the incredible string band, and Nick Drake, and also Barry Miles. And I did ask him, I said, what happened to you in the 70s? Because obviously you were there in the 60s, all, with the radical sort of alternative scene, setting up all these events and bookshops and galleries, etc., etc. And he said, well, actually, we just got tired. We were just exhausted by the end of the 60s. And thus, his story doesn't end, but suddenly he can't keep it going. I kind of realized with people like Jerry Rubin, who must have taken that to another level,
You
emotionally,
did.
he must have felt absolutely shattered by it all.
Well, that's what I was talking about a few minutes ago in the interview. That's why he went to San Francisco and got into yoga and meditation and health food, because he was exhausted, and I love and respect Barry Miles, but Barry was tired. Rubin was probably even more tired.
Yes,
Because he was
absolutely.
on the front lines of this stuff. So I think, frankly, if Jerry had not done that, he might have become an alcoholic. He might have became chronically depressed. In other words, he was smart enough to recharge his own batteries. Nobody can recharge batteries for you, right? You
Yes.
have to recharge your own batteries, whatever that might be. Some people drop out and they go to India for 6 months or whatever. So yeah, that was the thing. But Jerry also still had all this manic energy, which is why he got into the social networking, and then he got into the health food drinks and all of that.
Yes. And
Jerry,
so on that sort of side of being able to make great changes, a bit like what David Bowie did throughout his life, where he was able to sort of
yeah,
kind of
good
be kind
analogy.
of obsessed with soul music, or get obsessed with kind of German electronic kind of soundscapes with his album Low. I mean, obviously with Jerry, I mean, one of the things which is kind of interesting is the fact that he was kind of an early adopter, or certainly saw the potential in Apple computers, didn't he?
Well, yeah, a little bit. It says on his Wikipedia page that he was an early investor in Apple. That is a myth. But what Jerry did see is that he started to see his girlfriend of the time. He by the time he died, he was divorced and he was dating another woman, and she's interviewed in the book. He was starting to look at these personal computers in the early 90s, and began to anticipate things like email, and that type of thing. So Jerry, I wouldn't say he was a technological wizard, but he was a little bit of a visionary when it comes. I keep coming back to this word networking. You know,
Yes.
um, and yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about that, other than he saw people have these computers, and he knew that someday we would all be talking to each other,
And that's
like
it.
we are right now.
So just to clear it up, he didn't make $1 million on the stock market with his Apple.
No, I wish I could change the Wikipedia page. I should probably try to. He did not make $1 million off of Apple. Again, I know I've said it 5 times. He did not vote for Ronald Reagan. He did not become a Republican.
No, absolutely. That's amazing. And sort of just lastly then, what was the one thing that you found out from doing this project that was surprising, that made you think, oh, that's quite boggling? You probably assumed a few things beforehand, but having gone through all his stuff, which must have felt both interesting and a bit weird, I just wondered.
Yeah, well, I wasn't fully sure of Jerry's political leanings towards the end of his life. So again, not to say it for the 30th time, but it was good to realize that he stayed democratic, liberal, progressive. But also, I think the main thing that Jerry had that Abbie Hoffman didn't have, and Tom Hayden didn't have, and all these other guys, Jerry was willing to be vulnerable. Jerry was doing interviews in the 70s where he was talking about, sometimes I can't get an erection during sex, or sometimes I feel intimidated when I'm in bed with a naked woman. Like, Jerry, these guys were all born in the 1940s, right? So they're the same age roughly as, Jagger, Richards, Ray Davies, right? These are not guys that are going to do interviews and talk. The only person close to that might be Pete Townsend, right? Because if you're a Townsend fan like I am, he'll say self-embarrassing stuff. Right? Like he might say, yeah, one time I saw Bowie and then I went home and I masturbated thinking about him, right? Or something like that. But most of these guys aren't going to do that, right? Now, Jerry didn't have any homoerotic things. I'm not trying to put him in that category, but he was willing to discuss the vulnerability of sex. He was willing to discuss his emotional vulnerability, right? I mean, you could have put a gun to Abbie Hoffman's head. Now, Abbie committed suicide partially because he was manic depressive, but that's not something Abbie would ever have shared in an interview, right? So the thing that I really admire about Jerry is his ability to be vulnerable, his ability to sometimes say I was wrong. He later realized that he should have given women more support in the 60s. He became more feminized. So Jerry was human and vulnerable, and I think emotionally honest. Most people were not that emotionally honest in public, I think.
Yes, it was just a shame he wasn't around a bit longer, really, because it's obviously would have been fascinating another couple of decades, really.
That's true.
This is true. Indeed. I think we'll leave it there. It's an emotional goodbye, which you don't need to hear. Anyway, a massive thank you to Pat Thomas giving me the time for that interview, talking about the book, about Jerry Rubin. The book is titled Did It? And like I said, available from all good bookshops and also online. From Yippie to Yuppie, an American revolutionary. This has been the C86 Show. I'm David Eastaugh. If you want to contact me, you can on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, do C86 Show. Keep it positive. Also, I've been doing lots of interviews, mostly about 80s indie bands, but sometimes 70s and 90s. So you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, if you're that way inclined. Anyway, check it out. There might be something there for you. And that's it. Right. Have a great week. Stay safe.